In a Great Night for a Ritual, the player will use breakable items and weapons, and three abilities that they'll choose to fight their way through enemy mobs. A Great Night for a Ritual is a dungeon crawler arena hybrid game where no weapon is permanent and the only thing you can rely on is strategy. The basic rules is that the player will fight their way through mobs of enemies using whatever weapons and tools they can find amongst the dead bodies, chests, and the enemies that they slay. Each weapon breaks and every consumable runs out eventually, so that's why it's important to determine what to use early on. The player's goal is to fight off every mob that is spawned onto the arena, and after the player has slain enough enemies at the end of each level, they'll have to face an elite mob of enemies that only spawn after the ritual bar is filled. Once the last enemy is slain, they will drop a key that will give access to the next level. The player is working against the mobs of enemies that spawn into the arena. The mobs are spawned into the game on specific timestamps. I believe this way is going to add pressure to the experience. Once the player survives all of the mobs, then the final wave spawns in. These elite mobs will feature special vampires or monsters that introduce new mechanics to the game, such as bloodcasters, summoners, even werewolves, and more. The player can choose what items to leave throughout the dungeon and what items and weapons they want to use earlier in the wave sequence. This is important as it will determine how strong the enemies at the end of the level will appear to be. The player chooses their ability set before the game begins. These three different abilities will determine how the player will play the game. The player will also have a chance at upgrading certain aspects about the protagonist, such as move speed, health, and ability cooldowns. The player takes control of a vampire hunter trapped in Bran Castle, the home of Dracula. The enemies the player faces are Dracula fanatics, human slaves, monsters, and vampires who all worship the Count. The vampire hunter was sent to stop a cult leader from summoning the Prince of Darkness. The perspective of the game is 2D top-down so that the player can make note of where the items are in the arena, and that they'll need to know where they are going to be able to dodge enemy attacks and set up for takedowns. A Great Night for a Ritual will play sort of like a dungeon crawler, like Diablo, but with a different take on weapons and how the player faces their enemies. The player also doesn't have access to a massive set of skill trees, multiple classes, and has limited access to the list of abilities that the player has to choose from. It's like Diablo 3 and Battlerite mixed together, except where Battlerite is online and is played cooperatively against other players. A Great Night for a Ritual is played offline and against AI monsters. So the player will be able to have access to a list of abilities that are mostly used for setting up plays and not causing damage. The player is being chased down by a mob of vampire scouts that are close range attackers as the player is landing arrows being shot from their crossbows, the player suddenly vanishes, causing the mob to become unaware of where the player went. During this time, the player can choose to lure one of the enemies away using their second ability. Once the player has the enemy in another room, they can then use their last ability to put the enemy to sleep and finally execute them for bonus points without using or breaking a weapon. The player was able to cut down the pack by one. The development risks is that the team might not have cohesive sprite art in which some things about the game will be developed to a simplistic aesthetic design. The game idea itself is fairly unheard of, although a lot of games use the dungeon running idea differently. I think that maybe it might not be as engaging as I want it to be. The balance in the game might be a very hard thing to achieve due to the fact that the player has access to pretty strong abilities and weapons break after a while. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Created using Powtoon.